I'll use a diet metaphor, right? We're getting ready. We are going into swim season, right? So I use the diet metaphor. And it's like, how many times have we tried to go on a diet with behaviors? I'm gonna do these behaviors, and this time it's gonna work. And it just doesn't stick very much. But yet, if you just spend months working on the inside, right? The mindset.
I want us to talk for a moment around these roles, the roles that exist within the coaching situation. It's all about people, yes, developing people. So we have a coach, it could be internal, external. We have a coachee, and then we have an organization, stakeholders, HR, the person's boss, something else. Talk to me, Teresa, in terms of what are the roles of these different, responsibilities, functions of these different roles here to make sure that coaching is successful?
Well, that is a really critical point too, because without getting role clarity amongst all those people in the very beginning, coaching can go south pretty quick, right? Because coaching needs to be a true relationship between the coach and the client. There needs to be a significant level of confidentiality to create a safe and fertile place, a productive place to make the change happen. So one of the things that I think is important is that if we look, I'll just kind of walk through the roles, right? So the role for the client is really the client does the work. And we want the client from the beginning to recognize that this is not a consulting, mentoring, or training, which they might already be used to. Many people that haven't had coaching before, they have expectations. And so part of the coach's role in the beginning is to get real clarity on what is the client's responsibility here, because change, isn't very effective from the outside. And so when the client starts to own and have full accountability for that, knowing that they are responsible for what they're working on, doing the work in between sessions, coming prepared to the sessions, then that gets everything off to a strong footing. The coach's role is really about being an expert in the coaching toolkit, right? This toolkit is defined by the International Coaching Federation. We have very specific competencies that we follow. And so my expertise is in those things, which means I don't have to be an expert in your industry, your job, your role, your level. I am an expert in those tools, and those tools can be applied across all those things. And so the person then begins to understand that my job is to kind of ask some hard and challenging, yet supportive questions, to make observations about maybe some things I'm noticing, like those blind spots we talked about earlier. And to providing the client with that safe space to really start exploring. So there's some challenge and support that come together as part of what I'm creating in that space. My job to create that fertile space. The stakeholders all have different roles too. Sometimes the leader that I'm coaching, their leader might want to be involved in goal setting. That can be very appropriate. So we might have like a little triad where the three of us will meet, and we'll talk about what are the goals that are both valuable to the person being coached, the executive leader, and their leader, or maybe another stakeholder like HR stepping in for that role as well. Could be any of those things. And so there we're all clear up front about what we're working on. And then sometimes there are other stakeholders. Those might be customers, they might be direct reports, they might be peers. And we often engage them through a 360 or interview, some way to kind of gather their input on what they need to see from this person in terms of change. And so that can be an important part of data gathering. We also want to make sure that the other stakeholders, especially whether it's leadership development HR or the leader's leader, about what that confidentiality really means. There aren't going to be detailed reports about what we worked on from the coach. If you need those, the best person to get that from is the person being coached, so that that safe and confidential space is maintained. And so that setting that expectation up front is helpful. And then finally, I'll say that if there is a lot of engagement from the leader's leader, is for them to provide feedback along the way as well. What are they seeing that's working? What are they noticing that's different? Where do they see, if there's something they've seen that they aren't giving feedback on that probably should be, right? That there's a behavior issue or challenge. We want them to have accountability for their role in coaching success. And sharing that is also important.
As you're going through all of this, I'm curious for all of the listeners here, I wonder what roles people have who are listening.
Mhm.
And so for everyone who's listening, if you could please in the Q&A, identify, are you going to be coached or are you being coached? Are you a coachee or are you a coach, either internal or external? Or are you a stakeholder in the organization who might bring in a coach or have oversight to help support that process? As you're hearing this, and frankly, you might be multiple. Great. List any of those roles out. We'd love to see who is on the call. What is the mindset? We're already beginning to see both the coach and the coachee, executive coach, stakeholder and coach, coach external, and we just continue on. Please keep them coming. Coach at mid-level, coach and coachee. So many folks have multiple hats. And so, Teresa, talk about then being clear on what your role is, because sometimes you might actually have different hats depending upon the situation.
I want to make sure I understand the question. So is this for my role wearing a coach's hat and how my hat changes, or are we talking about these other stakeholders and how their hats may change?
I guess the real point is, how do we help ourselves be clear about the roles, especially when we may have different situations where we might be different roles in them. And we need to be clear to how we switch and how we show up.
Okay. So if I am, for example, one interesting switch I'll talk about, and I don't know if this applies to anyone, for the internal coaches, they are expected to wear multiple hats, and they are sometimes in the hat of mentor, trainer, facilitator, intervention, that may be their roles. And then all of a sudden they're expected to change onto a coaching hat, set those roles aside and create a confidential, productive environment for coaching to occur. And so that is one of the more challenging multiple hat roles to wear is that of the internal coach, because they are expected to do all these roles in a very different way. They also have an expectation of reporting that is often different. The external coach can say, as an external coach, I don't provide reporting because that breaks the bounds of confidentiality and breaks trust and keeps us from having a really fertile space. But the internal coach, because they're owned by the organization, they set those expectations. That's much harder to push back on. So that's probably one that I would say is the most. Maybe one of the others that can have a really big impact is the role of the leader of the person being coached, because they're also wearing multiple hats, right? They have their responsibility for outcomes hat, their responsibility for performance hat, while also being in that supportive place of allowing coaching to unfold, take the time it needs to for behavior changes to occur, providing good feedback along the way that I've already mentioned. So they wear a couple of multiple roles and hats as well.
I've often thought of, there are two work streams happening during the coaching process. One work stream tends to be kind of the overarching set of goals, one or two or three overarching themes, general objectives, and then further defining the actions that need to happen. The other work stream seems to be session to session stuff that comes up that, yes, it can relate to the larger goals, but sometimes it's, hey, can you help me think through this? Can you help? Teresa, how do you kind of manage those two work streams that seem to keep popping up and that are needed, that are important, ongoing work?
Well, that's a very interesting point. The ICF has recognized this, and they actually have built that into the skill set. And it's called the engagement agreement, right? Versus the session agreements. And the one way the coach can facilitate that process is when the client, let's say we're working on preparing for a promotion, right? We're on the succession path. We're maybe one of 12 executives on the succession path for the next level of role. Maybe might be in a leadership training plan in our company. And so they have some very specific goals on what it takes to be ready for that next level. And that's the engagement agreement that we have. And those are the engagement goals that we've established with success measures. And then they show up and say, you know, I've been tagged to do a board presentation. And I have a tendency to get very tactical in my presentations and give way too much data. And my boss has already warned me that will not work at the board level. And so we spend the whole session kind of exploring that and discussing it and coming up with alternative plans. But the coach then will always tag. So what will this do to forward you towards the engagement goal that we have about preparing for promotion? How will this prepare you for that next big step? And that, you know, and that really makes it important, right? That raises the importance of this, what seemingly feels like a rabbit trail for today. We really make that tie and then always kind of put those back together.
Oh, this is cool. Okay, so I'm gonna keep asking lots of questions, but everybody who's listening, please, at this point, type in questions that you may have around specific coaching engagements, confidentiality. We're not diving into, no, but in terms of process, in terms of what can be done to access and ensure coaching success, please keep the questions coming and we'll be able to then reference that. And something you were saying, Teresa, I often will think of the metaphor of jazz. Jazz is so often spontaneous. And I often will think of a coaching conversation as it is a bit of like jazz, because as a coach, you need to have enough understanding of the basics and the process, but you need to be able to be flexible in the moment of where you're going to go while still having a general idea of the overall rhythm. And how do we connect this? How do you see that playing out in terms of benefiting and creating a great coaching experience? Yeah. And even there, you were beginning to go through so many different topics that could be addressed in coaching. Run through a few more. What have been some of topics that have come out that you've been engaged with coaching clients on? What sorts of things are the focus areas?
One big one, you know, I said I do a lot of work with, you know, preparations for promotion and assimilation, or barriers to promotion, right? We get that sometimes too. But one of the things that comes up time and time again is that I call it the what got you here won't get you there model, which is I'm an excellent tactician. I know how to execute on a plan. I know how to lead teams to execute on a plan. I can be incredibly tactical and I can get the job done. And then I'm migrating or have migrated into a job that requires me to think and be strategic. I don't even know how to run a calendar that isn't packed. If my calendar is packed, if my email is packed, there is no time to be strategic. There is no brain space to be strategic, right? And so if I am working all the time and I am running on empty, then that keeps me from being the powerful, strategic, compelling leader who knows how to influence people versus direct people, right? Because certain levels move from the power is in being able to direct because you have direct control to being able to influence because you don't control anybody. You don't control your peers. You don't control external vendors. You don't control you know, your boss, your boss's peers. And so all of those things require you to have this whole new mindset around tactical to strategic leap and shift. That's a big one. I get that one a lot. And they're and if you think about, for example, a CFO role, there are tactical CFOs and there are strategic CFOs. And those are both very different roles. And sometimes one has to move into the other in order to grow their career. And yet that is a shock to them, right? To be able to move from point A to point B, or they don't know how. They want to do it, but don't know how.